you had to pay a couple extra $1,000 to get it started slower and
Yeah,
go right away.
right.
The kids just like to see what's all over.
Sure.
I get it. Here, come on. I just found out that the top locomotive is the one.
Just have one more minute to get something up here.
Yeah, sure. Take your time. Take your time.
And very, very, very.
Okay. Well, I know Jim's grabbing something for me. He'll come in and all
Yeah,
that.
that's
But I want to welcome everybody to the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum. Scott Houston, the president, and really appreciate you coming out tonight. We you never know with the lectures, the attendance, with the RSVPs. We're kind of have an open door policy, and as we were discussing, it's great to just have a forum where we can have lectures and discussions, and we're happy to do that tonight. I'm thankful that you all came out tonight, whether or not you have power or not. That may be the case. You can charge your iPhones if you want, or anything like that, as I may here in a minute. But tonight is it's interesting. It's not necessarily tonight, but it's the year. 2014 is the 30th anniversary, I believe, of the trial court ruling on Goodman versus Lukens. But it's also the 50th anniversary of the passing of the Civil Rights Act, 1964, and then this case, interestingly enough, moves, is a case about 9 years later, when it's originally filed in 1973, and the trial court rules on it after, let me see if it was 2,000 exhibits and 57 witnesses and such. That the trial court ruled that Lukens had discriminated against African American employees, and that those practices obviously should, cease to, exist, and that the grievance process of the union as well, had discriminatory practices. And then, of course, so the trial court rules, that's 30 years ago, and then it moves from there, to the Supreme Court, and that's where then the Supreme Court ruled on the statute of limitations and the availability of the monetary value to the plaintiffs, and it also ruled on the, requiring the union to end its discriminatory practices. And it's interesting how that moves along, and that's not, it doesn't seem too long ago, and how things change. And it's great to have the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum, so that at Lukens you have many, social change over time. And so you're going to set the context for that. So we're very happy to have Dr. Craig Stutman here tonight. He is assistant professor of history and policy studies at Delaware Valley College. And I just highlighted a few things, so bear with me, just to set the context. Specializes in history of race and ethnicity in the United States, Civil War and Reconstruction eras, which of course is also 150th anniversary of that. Pennsylvania history, the history of poverty, welfare, and social justice, and formerly serving as lead research historian and writer in National Park Service in a context study about the history and built environment of African Americans in Pennsylvania, and a project which was administered by the African American Museum in Philadelphia and the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission. And I know you're a BA in history, Penn State, and you got your doctorate at Temple. But then, speaking about the African American history, I'll just highlight one thing that we had talked about briefly is the Communities in Common Project, which is African Americans in Pennsylvania, 1690 to 2000, and that's located at the State of Pennsylvania website. And I look forward to checking out that research. And as well, you've served on a few panels. I'll just mention a couple which were most recent. Moderator in a panel, William Still and the Underground Railroad, Germantown, Juneteenth celebration sponsored by the Johnson House and Historic Germantown, and then as well the African American Museum of Philadelphia, the Henry Osawa Tanner Artistry and Activism, which is part of a lecture with the exhibit, Henry What's that?
You're saying yeah, sometimes it's
Osawa.
said Osawa and other times Osawa. It's different.
So we're very happy to have you tonight to talk about the social context and what led up to end the case of Goodman versus Lukens.
Great.
So
Well,
thank you very much.
thank you very much.
Is that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court or the federal Supreme Court?
This is it will go all the way up to the federal Supreme
We're
Court.
still in process.
Yeah, well, there's questions about distributions and potential follow-up cases, but that's really essentially kind of where I'm going to get to today. But
Make my guess.
yeah. But actually, it's a good point because it does show the significance of this case. I mean, it's clearly a significant case locally, regionally, nationally as well, and so that's something that I'll talk about. Although I will back up for a second and say that I'm not going to talk entirely about the case. In fact, I'm going to do two things with the lecture discussion. One is going to be setting the context. When I did this study on African Americans in Pennsylvania back in 2008 with the Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission and the African American Museum, I was out of my doctoral program from Temple. I was the historian on the project. There was a historic preservationist on the project named Shelby Weaver Splain, who was assisting me. We were both colleagues. Actually, we were assisting each other. We were both colleagues on the project, looking at different angles. She was more or less looking at the issues and the structure of National Registry nominations, the built environment part of the piece that we were talking about. And I was looking more at the history in the context of Pennsylvania history in general and African American history, and then of course African American history in Pennsylvania. We ended up having several cities that were kind of case study cities that were listed that we probably spent a little more time in doing research, even though we went throughout the state and did our best with the limited amount of time we had to go to historical societies. Coatesville was one of those cities that was among the initial kind of grouping case study cities, just to kind of look at a timeline of history within different cities, differing demographics, differing laboring opportunities. So it was kind of putting really kind of a puzzle together with all these different kinds of factors. We also obviously couldn't reinvent the wheel here. We were relying a lot, especially for the limited amount of time we had, to, and myself in particular, to say, well, what was written about African American history in Pennsylvania over the last several hundred years? That was a big piece of the study. It was what they call historiographical or historiography, which was basically putting together those stories, whether they were in county histories or whether and there were pieces that were mentioned there, or whether they were actually African American historical overviews, in some cases by African American historians and or amateur historians. W.B. Du Bois as a historian actually does kind of come into the play here in terms of doing local and regional history around this area as well as the rest of the country. So there's historians, there's amateur historians, there's African American writers, there's white writers, people with different perspectives, obviously, and trying to kind of take that information out there, number one. Number two, and sift through it, and then look thematically at different areas, labor history, religious history, entertainment, and kind of fraternal societies, and kind of put it all together and try to look then and break these kinds of things down based on these themes, and also then in terms of the built environment part, and of course the issue for the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission was to look at, could we potentially have as a context study, which I was the context study writer, could we potentially have information to inform how we can nominate properties for the National Registry of Historic Places or for state marker programs. So there's that material, physical piece to this kind of aspect as opposed to just the history. So it was a lot. It was biting off a lot in a relatively limited time. However, I think we did, a good job, at the very least, a good starting point and jumping off point for further research in all sorts of areas like this, like the stories today, like the stories in Coatesville, like the stories of Lukens. We just kind of started these dialogues. They obviously have already been written about as well, and the discourses are talked about, and they're very provocative discourses. There's no question about it. My feeling is, as a historian, is that if you don't understand the history of race, ethnicity, religion in America, then you don't understand American history at all. It doesn't mean that people don't have intimate experiences with their own identities. So then when we tell history, often we probably think that how do we trust or respect the person who's telling the story? That's a very tricky piece of history, and being unbiased and whatever your political persuasion is or your ethnicity, etc. I don't try to say that is not a factor. I think it's always going to be a factor. Bias is there. But I do think a good historian can try to separate themselves as best as possible. And that's what I try to do here. There's a lot of material that we tried to undertake here, interviews of individuals, to try to kind of put these stories together, including the story of Coatesville's African American history, primary source material, census material, and books on both sides, or books on all different kinds of sides that address these topics. That's the best we can do, right, as any historian, I think, to probably try to get that material out there. That doesn't mean, however, that there aren't incredibly provocative things and very tricky and difficult things to talk about, which I still think are important to talk about. And if I didn't think that was the case, I probably wouldn't be involved in this field in the first place. But there's no question some of these areas are quite provocative, and I think it is, as much as there's going to be some very serious things and things that may seem gray areas about like how you kind of can imply what I'm going to say tonight versus like issues of industry or labor or all these kinds of things, and there's issues that are they're out there. At the same time, I do think it's important to say that even having the dialogue and even having a dialogue in Lukens and having the ability for it to even be discussed is pretty amazing. I mean, the fact that Lukens Steel, the National Iron and Steel Museum here, is undertaking a provocative issue, and so that being said, I don't want to give too much of that background. I want to get into the meat and potatoes here, but I just want to say that I do think that it's we also owe a great thanks for Lukens to say this is an issue, and we're going to put it out there as a historical issue. You know, that it's not something that's just, you know, not out there. Okay, so part of what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a bit from a section that I had written and keep editing on the steel industry in Pennsylvania. It's going to kind of talk about African American steel workers, and it's going to kind of eventually start to go into Coatesville and talk about Lukens as well as some background here. So that, as I mentioned, will be the first part of what we'll talk about tonight, and then the second part will be well, actually, there will be three parts. The second part will have to do with what was happening in the 1950s and 60s at other steel mills around the country, and in terms of African American advocacy potentially for civil rights, and also issues of what was happening in the workplace, and are there legal angles and avenues to try to address these issues. And the third piece will be the Goodman case, and at least looking at it from these several different decisions that were that had taken place, and kind of trying to analyze a bit of what the judges had said in these decisions. So we'll kind of try to do on those three levels tonight, and then obviously have any kind of discussion or feedback. So the history of African Americans in Pennsylvania steel mills is long and varied. The steel industry's growth followed on the heels of the downturn in the significance of the iron furnace industry, which we were just talking about earlier tonight, and the discovery of large reserves of anthracite and bituminous coal, the fuel sources needed to run such intensive operations. So this is just the typical industrial revolution kind of highlights of the steel industry. The issues of the Bessemer process, as anybody who's involved, and I'm sure you know here, I'm not going to necessarily do the best job because I'm not a history of science historian, or am I a legal historian? I'm a social and cultural historian studying these issues, and they're always going to be part of the issue. So I'm always going to talk about those things because they'll come up. But just the basics of the Bessemer process, and the fact that you end up having an easier and cheaper process to be able to produce higher yield and to produce stronger material, etc. So you end up getting this system happening, this industry growing, but at the same time you have the issues that are then now surrounding, well, who's going to work in the industry? Who are the laborers? What about the labor unions that are eventually going to potentially start to arise by the late 19th century as well? And the issue of African American history is certainly going to be an interesting one here, because we're going to talk about issues of where African Americans in Pennsylvania were prior to this. There are certainly African Americans in Coatesville region, as we'll see coming up here in a bit. But generally, the issues of migrations to areas where there are industry, and often from the south to the north, and that's certainly going to happen here. So basically, the study that I was doing for the state examines two particular regions. So we looked mostly at Pittsburgh and southwestern Pennsylvania, not surprising, and then also or southern Pennsylvania in terms of steel, iron and steel. And then we did look at Coatesville. We could have done so much more. I mean, there are plenty of peripheral, not even peripheral stories, very significant stories in cities, Hazleton and Harrisburg and Steelton and all sorts of other areas around the state we could have gotten into. But just case study-wise, we looked at several cities. So basically, it's very interesting findings in terms of African-American steel workers. So if we talk about Pittsburgh, for example, there's a new generation of iron and steel businesses that would hire African-American employees there. One particular business known as the Black Diamond Steel Works that was run by several prominent members of one of the city's enterprising business families known as the Park Brothers. The Parks were displeased with what they saw as the havoc created by the rise of white puddlers unions in the city in 1875, especially the Sons of Vulcan, organized to demand better wages and working conditions. To counter this threat, they and other business owners, including the managers of the Pittsburgh Bolt Company, decided to import African-American puddlers from the South to operate the largely abandoned blast furnaces. By the way, we also get into a whole other dynamic here that we'll talk about more. I'm kind of going back and forth from a lecture to discussion myself, but the issue of, and something I'd like everyone to kind of think about too, the issue of unions and union membership being allowed or not allowed based on race, and then what ends up happening with issues of scabs or strike breakers. And if you already have a tempestuous environment where you end up having, or tempestuous environment where you already have issues of racial tension, then you kind of throw all these kinds of things, and it's a chemistry experiment for sometimes some serious issues. That doesn't condone the issues that end up coming up. It's just because the issues are often hostility based on race, other than the fact that class is getting involved here and issues of labor are going to be getting involved. Two significant phenomenon actually can better explain why African American workers were not necessarily involved in unions in much of the late 19th century and early 20th century. One, many African Americans were not typically admitted to unions in the late 19th and early 20th century. And basically, black exclusion from organized labor provided industrial employers with opportunities to use black workers to defeat striking white unionists, exactly what I was basically telling you there before. Dennis Dickerson goes on to say, who's an African-American historian who's written about these issues, uncertainty on the issue of biracial unionism characterized with the positions of most labor federations in the late 19th century highlighted this. Within individual unions, however, forthright statements and practices which barred black membership usually prevailed. Since the majority of affiliate unions enforced racial restrictions through constitutional and ritualistic bans and through informal exclusionary practices, black members remained pitifully few. So you can already see the seeds that are going to be kind of, I think, going through American ethnic history here and class history and issues of labor history that are kind of sowed in some ways in the mid to late 19th century. This is certainly the case, for example, for the early labor unions. The National Labor Union, founded in 1866, and the Knights of Labor, organized in 1869, which, with Samuel Gomper's American Federation of Labor, established in 1886, called for only limited membership of African American unionists. Many early African American steelworkers did not value memberships in unions such as all because of these reasons, nor did they feel any sympathy for their causes, which in theory may have been appealing, but in practice only illustrated the intolerance and bigotry on the part of white unionists not to expand their cause to include all laboring men, regardless of race. Regardless of whether these early African American steelworkers had been comprised of native Pennsylvanians or were among those who arrived in the first wave of black migration to the north, these laborers felt that they were more than capable to fill such jobs. The aptitude and skills of workers who had formerly toiled in Pennsylvania's iron furnaces before the emergence of the steel industry, which was an interracial industry, and slave and indentured servant to even further back in the 1700s, as manning iron furnaces and gaining experience. Basically kind of sets the trend then here. The African American iron workers recruited to come north were at the vanguard of the Great Migration as well, which is this period after the Civil War and Reconstruction, really lasting from the late 19th century to the early 20th century because of racism in the South, because of segregation policies in the South, even though these things certainly will happen in the North as well, but also even more so possibly, or just as much so, because of the jobs and the issues of industry that is offering jobs for African Americans. But as we already saw, there's this kind of piece of the puzzle that's taking place here of the complexity of it often. The Puddlers, incidentally, basically who came to the Pittsburgh Bolt Company, the Black Diamond Steel Works, were among some of these individuals. They had been trained at the ironworks in Virginia and Tennessee while they were employed as either slaves or freemen in the past. So there's also experience, and that's another issue that we'll have to kind of look at later in terms of what happens with experienced individuals and those who say individuals don't have that kind of experience. And the courts will rule in regards to those issues. Many African American laborers felt spurned by labor unions that denied admittance. They took issue with their alleged status as strikebreakers, prompting many to speak out against the slight and elaborate on their abilities and the reasons for their allegiances. In a particular letter by an individual known as, quote, a colored puddler at Black Diamond Steel Works, quote, John Lucas Dennis ended up explaining his position here. He said, first of all, he opened his letter entitled "The Pittsburgh Strike: Why the Colored Workmen Take Little Part in It." He signed it as a colored, quote, a colored puddler at Black Diamond Steel Works. He said, "As the strike is now in progress at the Black Diamond Steel Works, where many of our race are employed, the colored people hereabouts feel a deep interest in its final outcome. As yet few colored men have taken part in it, it have been thus far thought unwise to do so. It is true our white brothers, having joined the Knights of Labor and organized the strike without conferring with or in any way consulting us, now invite us to join them and help obtain the desired increase in wages and control of the Knights of Labor of the works. But as we were not taken into their schemes at its inception, and as it was thought by them that no trouble would be experienced in obtaining what they wanted without our assistance, we question very much the sincerity and honesty of this invitation." Further expounding upon these issues, he says, "Our experiences as a race with these organizations has, on the whole, not been such to give us either great satisfaction or confidence in white men's fidelity. For so often, after we have joined them and the desired object has been attained, we've discovered that sinister and selfish motives were the whole and only cause that led them to seek us as members." And basically, here you can kind of see that he's talking about these same issues that I've already laid out in the beginning of this discussion or this lecture, which is based that it's often being between a rock and a hard place to have a kind of position of needing a job, potentially wanting to support a union but not being allowed in a union, possibly supporting the cause of a union but also, because you're not involved in the union, become a strikebreaker. It can be a very complicated situation. And he even says, for example, he goes on saying a little more, God forbid that I should be when its members are honest, just, and true, but when I join any society, I want to have pretty strong assurances that I will be treated fairly. I do not want to join an organization, the members of which will refuse to work by my side because of the color of my skin, happens to be of a darker hue than their own. Now, what the white men in these organizations should and must do if they want colored men to join with and confide in them, is to give them a square deal and give them a genuine white man's chance, and that would be the help. So we also see other kinds of issues that take place even in southwestern PA, and this I'll very soon get to Coatesville here, such as the Homestead Strike of 1892, which is a significant piece in labor union motivation and uprising, but at the same time one that has an issue of utilizing the company itself, utilizing African American migrants and strikebreakers. So you end up having, as Paul Krauss had written in his book, The Battle for Homestead, 1880 to 1892, that, quote, racial unrest throughout the summer and fall finally exploded into a massive anti-black riot on 13th of November that saw 2,000 whites, many of them East European immigrants, attack the 50 black families who were by then living in the shantytown. I mean, very complicated situations here that are taking place. Owners of the steel plants realized that African American workers they were recruiting possessed a long history and proficiency in such work, but at the same time were thinking about the issue of cheaper pay and cheaper rate, which then also then exacerbates issues of economic problems between laboring individuals of any ethnic group. Even scholar Richard Wright, who in 1912 was talking about African Americans in steel mills and the steel industry in Pennsylvania, ended up saying that, quote, Negroes are largely employed in the steel mills and some have very responsible places. Negro puddlers, actually these are trimmers, not puddlers, and from 1890 from Lukens, which I didn't talk about early on, that picture up there. Negro puddlers are used exclusively in the Parks Mills, which is the Black Diamond. Negro rollers are employed in the old Clark's Mills, now owned by Carnegie Steel Company of the United Steel Corporation. And he also wrote in Clark's Mill there are actually 3 Negro foremen having under them as high as 20 men who are white as well as black. So you can see that there are, I guess you could say, fits and starts in this kind of whole process of going beyond the issue of race and getting fair employment opportunities and or being accepted or rejected by unions. Generally, it's really going to take until the 1920s, and you start to see African American labor union organization, in particular with A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which unifies African American sleeping car porters together, and then eventually is a group that is sanctioned by the AFL and the AFL-CIO within the 1930s. That you really start to see some major increases in kind of the idea of there should really not be necessarily a racial component to unionization in general, at least idealistically speaking. But let me move now to Coatesville and move to what ends up happening in Coatesville's history and how that also basically parallels some of what we saw here or heard already. As I mentioned, when we did this study, we looked at the history of Coatesville, the history of Chester County on a number of levels. We looked at it not just in terms of the Lukens family and Lukens Steel and iron furnace to steel mill and laboring opportunities for anyone in the area, potentially, but also the issues of agriculture, issues of the Underground Railroad. I mean, the fact that Pennsylvania and southeastern Pennsylvania, southern Pennsylvania in general, played often a large, significant role, often disproportionately with Quakers who are in the region as well, that are helping on these kinds of issues. Again, a very complicated kind of scenario of individuals who are willing to help, but also the kind of old school issues about race and racial hierarchy that are often transcend these time periods and often still play out. So when we look at just kind of very general basic history of Lukens, and you end up moving in transition from boilerplates of ships to the steel company that eventually starts in the late 19th century. You basically break down the African American community in 2 ways. One, there's the already existent African American community who is working in artisan jobs or in agriculture or were part of the community from the early to mid 19th century onward in this area, and started to establish institutions, religious institutions, fraternal institutions, political institutions, civil rights institutions. You also have the next phase, and this is often this kind of dichotomy of so many northern cities, the migrants from the South who are coming up based on the Great Migration, and also, again, for issues of race also and or racism, issues of jobs or job availability, issues for potential housing that may or may not exist. So certainly by 1900, you're going to end up seeing a thriving African American community of both groups essentially here in terms of the early demographic of individuals who were in the region and or migrated from other areas of Pennsylvania throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, and those who are coming in large numbers from the South to industries like the steel industry in the brickyards of central Pennsylvania, the coal mines of mostly southwestern PA, not as much northeastern PA, which were not necessarily as diverse ethnically. So by 1900, the census stated that 433 African Americans lived in Coatesville as part of a thriving community of business owners, artisans, and laborers who many of their numbers arrival dated to the period immediately following the Civil War. Predating and immediately following the Civil War, but not necessarily for issues of the steel mill at this period of time. African Americans developed a largely significant business and residential district known as the East End. Only a few of these individuals had worked in the region's nascent steel mills, so it's not really that specific, big, large transition yet in terms of that laboring opportunity. That certainly changes, as I mentioned, with the onset of the Great Migration from south to north, and it's known as the Great Migration. So many African Americans, specifically here, moved to Coatesville to find employment. So then by 1910, according to another census, a very interesting document that's really insightful in African American history in the early 20th century, written by Richard Wright, is the 1910, what it's called in quotes, Negro Business African Americans Survey, and in that survey and directory, and in that directory, among the community's population of 1,800 African Americans by 1910, so we're talking about 433 to 800, so that would be a 100% increase, 200, almost a 300% increase, I believe, here in population. Among this 1,800 in 10 years. There were employed at Lukens Steel, 92 in the trimming gang. So here we actually have a trimming gang picture from 1890, potentially. Although that, by the way, let me just get back to that. I don't have this up to scroll down. That's a question mark date that they have for this picture and this photo. That could be 1900. It could be 1910.
What is on the date?
The date is 1890 question mark. So, this is another one of those things that has to kind of be explored a little more. It seems like it's a little bit of a larger group for 1890 from everything we're kind of looking at research-wise here, but you never know. I mean, these are all these kinds of questions to explore numbers-wise. But trimming gang plate mills, 92 as of 1910. Head and patent shearers, 6 as of 1910. Transfer tables, 10. Boiler room workers, 1. Conductors and shifters, 2. Open hearth stocking and supply department, 17. Open hearth scrap shears department, 32. General labor, 12. The total number, 172 individuals, African American individuals working at Lukens Steel as of 1910. And you also have to put all of this into context with the other things happening in Coatesville. And sadly, we now turn to that chapter of the Zachariah Walker lynching, which only happened several years later in 1912. So clearly, this is a very tumultuous time. I said tempestuous before, but tumultuous is probably a better word. Time for America and American history. The issue of race riots, the issue of lynchings that are happening in the North as well as the South, whether they can, again, I do want to kind of stop here and just say I don't want to diminish the fact that just because there's these economic angles taking place here, and just because there are issues of economic tension, that can be deflected into a racial animosity or anger, doesn't justify that is where it goes into a position of such hatred and violence and this kind of offshoot. But it's a piece of the puzzle of what's all happening here as these dynamics are playing out. And clearly, we know with this case, in 1911, in the summer of 1911, on some levels is a manifestation of the hostilities within the steel industry. I mean, within the industry, based on bringing in importing labor, based on issues of unionization or lack of unionization, scab workers, ethnicity, all these tensions are out there, and they're there in many northern cities. Many scholars who discuss issues of race riots or lynchings, whether they're in the North or in the South, often see an economic motive behind a lot of these kinds of issues, at least in terms of what may be driving somebody's fear. And again, certainly there's, the issue of going the next level to violence or frustration is another whole area. But often what ends up being talked about is that you often see the African American individual who is attacked is often seen as in a negative light. There's often an accusation of a rape or a murder or some kind of negative perspective that ends up then becoming a rumor or a myth, or it gets spread, and people utilize that kind of language, that horrible kind of language, essentially, to often have these things happen. Does it mean that in general there isn't criminality going on between white and black, or black and white, or things happening around the country that can certainly be provocative or horrible? No, of course that can happen, but most of these cases are generally exaggerated cases of charges that have to do with issues of, let's say, sexuality, and people's fears about what they call miscegenation, and all different kinds of fears that start to come up that then, play out with these economic underlying motives as well, issues of race and racial hierarchies, what they call social Darwinism at the time period, which is allowing people to feel that they are on top of another person ethnically, which, by the way, is itself a very complicated kind of dynamic, because often the Irish Catholic immigrants are often at the second rung of that bottom of that ladder, and why you end up seeing signs like "No Irish Need Apply" in the late 19th century, which kind of throws a whole kind of wrench in this whole system of race is still a big issue, and probably the biggest issue, because African Americans are going to be at the bottom, and Irish are going to move up that ladder. There's actually a book called "How the Irish Became White," a very interesting concept. It's like, sounds kind of amazing, to the whole title, by Noel Ignatieff. It's about assimilation, and assimilation of any Northern or Eastern European group coming over based on their ethnicity or religion or religious tradition, but often finding themselves at a lower end of a totem pole because of these concepts of racial hierarchy and these notions of what a hierarchy is based on race and ethnicity. Sadly, in terms of African Americans and African American history, there's still a bottom rung of the ladder that's often always difficult to ascend based on racial issues. Now, there's certainly going to be issues of class too, and they are all quite complicated. So let me just give you a tiny bit of insight of what happened in Coatesville in a 1912 article, when there was an article entitled, quote, "Negroes weren't taking any chances," quote, in the Westchester Daily Local News, rebuked Coatesville's violent and discriminatory policies. It said, "A gentleman of this place," the newspaper opined, "who has been on a business trip through the South, tells a story that he was he was in a town where an agent for one of the mills at Coatesville had arrived and was engaging to help bring onto the steel town to work in the plants there. He succeeded in getting quite a number of again, these terms are terms from the time, Negro or colored. So here it says, and even this picture is called colored trimmers. Colored men who had arrived at the station prepared to come north. They had not been informed as to the destination, merely being told it was in Pennsylvania. One of the men finally asked where they were to go, and when informed Coatesville was the place, they, one and all, picked up their belongings and started back into town. Informing the representative of the steel works that they had heard about the way Coatesville treated colored people, and that they, quote, were not taking any chances. So individuals really started to feel that this is not a place that's necessarily welcoming, at that time period, as an understatement. Nevertheless, in the years following the Walker tragedy, wave upon wave of African American migrants were drawn to the Coatesville area and its steel mills, such as Lukens, as employment opportunities increased exponentially. Many of these new residents began to settle in an area known as South Coatesville or Boxtown, as well as the East End, adjacent to the mills. And it's very interesting, we found in this study when I talked about W.E.B. Du Bois, who is the first African American scholar to graduate from the University of Pennsylvania with a sociology and history degree, and ends up writing what is called, the title of the book was called The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, and talks about sociology and urban sociology in the African American community in Philadelphia and southeastern PA. Even Du Bois commented in one of his articles about what was happening in Coatesville and these different towns. So it said many of the new residents, as I mentioned, they're in South Coatesville, they're in Boxtown, adjacent to the mills. Conditions were anything but ideal. Even Du Bois commented on the natures of Coatesville's migrant housing dilemma and the problems that African Americans encountered in the workplace in his 1923 article entitled The Segregated World. And he wrote, "Today, a half century since emancipation, the Negro worker still has his difficulties. In the first place, he usually enters the lowest and worst paid positions with the most difficult working conditions and with little or no chance of advancement. One has but to view the housing offered Negroes in the employ of the newest steel merger. Well-bred pigs ought not to be housed as colored workers are housed in and around Coatesville, PA, by the Midville, Bethlehem, and other steel companies. A pretty powerful condemnation coming from a very significant scholar, actually in the white and black community even at the time. I mean, he's the first African-American scholar to be involved in the American Historical Association. He actually has several lectures and discussions in the organization, although certainly his challenges as well. In addition with dealing with deplorable housing and working conditions, and this is going to be another story that's going to happen here and happen all over the country, it's the story of the Ku Klux Klan. And the story of the Klan has its kind of rebirth. The first was after the Civil War and the creation of this group, this organization, militant organization, terrorist organization, essentially, to try to combat the civil rights and political rights that were happening, the changes in the South that people were frustrated with, and they didn't want these changes to take place. The Klan ends up arising as one of these groups to attempt to suppress this. It doesn't work, essentially. The federal government gets involved. Even the 1870 Ku Klux Klan Act ends up suppressing the Klan and saying that this institution can arise, that it's interfering with the strategies of Reconstruction. We all know, of course, that any group is going to often go underground and potentially resurface. All groups are out there in terms of their activism or their ideas. There's always going to be the tricky thing about freedom of speech and censorship versus outright hostility and violence, and those kinds of issues, and terrorism or fear. So there's these kinds of issues. But it's also a matter of what's happening in the 1920s, what's happening after the film The Birth of a Nation in 1915, which is often thought of as a rallying cry for a new Klan to come into play. There's a lot of disillusioned individuals in the country, especially who are already having issues with ethnicity and race. It's not that this film itself is the kind of golden bullet or the smoking gun. There are a lot of scholars who say that it was kind of influential in being a big kind of piece of propaganda. You end up having riots all around cities in the north, including Philly. And sometimes the movie's censored based on public issues of public safety. And mayors kind of bringing these kinds of issues up. Although, again, it's tricky because it's the issue of censorship in the First Amendment and those kinds of things. But at the same time, the actions in the film are showing the Ku Klux Klan as the heroes of Reconstruction and Civil War, kind of cleaning up the changes in terms of civil rights that were happening in the South after the war. So whatever the impetus or not, you end up having the Klan in the North, and it's going to maintain a role. But it's a significant role in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s. And throughout the Midwest, you even have elected officials who are often explicitly Klan members in Indiana, Ohio, Colorado, some in Pennsylvania. So it's a kind of acceptable format. At the same time, when I talk about this issue, I often think it's not surprising that it's a format that's not going to last very long, because if you keep isolating people based on one group after another, eventually you're not going to have any constituents left. And that's, I think, what often happens with the Klan. It's not just African Americans, but it's Eastern Europeans, it's Jews next, it's labor, it's Catholics. Eventually the hostility from particular groups is kind of probably going to limit their reign. But no, it doesn't necessarily say that this is not an issue that's happening and one that people are dealing with in the North, and if you're African American, often doubly so. And then in regions like Westchester and regions like Coatesville, and law and order societies pop up in places like Coatesville that kind of talk about these issues. And then there are issues that kind of get surrounded to deportation of migrant steelworkers. We already talked about how this is a contentious issue. Issues of individuals coming in, are you allowed in the union or not? Now deportations start, and there's all sorts of controversy surrounding African American migrants who are now deported back to the South, and newspaper articles that are written about it. Leaders that say that they deny what's happening. For example, leaders from the Law and Order Society who say Coatesville emphatically denies in 1919 deporting worthy Negro laborers from the city, but admits taking a hand to rid the community of a lot of worthless men, both black and white, who refused to work and made it a practice out of fleecing their fellow men out of money in whatever manner it could. The key point is we see another layer of what happens here in American history, and again, the hard pieces of American history, but the important pieces that I think need to be talked about. regardless of all these difficulties, African American steel workers still continue to grow, and part of that's going to be because there are unions that open up more and more membership, especially by the 1930s. In 1929, though, the Pittsburgh Courier published an article citing a report of the Armstrong Association of Philadelphia, citing that, quote, Negroes have been employed at Lukens for a number of years, and we find them better as plate handlers and shearers than white men. So there's even a total bucking the system of what we're going to see. This is going to be a real interesting journey when you go through this information, because you see that kind of information. And in fact, it even says in that their tonnage rate of payment is higher because of less rejected materials. So even that kind of flies in the face of this gradual progression towards where we're going to get at Goodman versus Lukens. But we certainly are going to also see the issues that we already kind of are laying the groundwork for here too, based on race and based on potential for lack of mobility in within the industry and within the union as well. But I kind of wanted to point that out because I'm of the mindset that you kind of, if it doesn't even support your hypothesis, you kind of still have to put it out there, because there's things that are out there that are very interesting here. You also end up having occupational hazards, though, that don't diminish, and they're happening across the board. I mean, there's just something, of course, unions are going to fight for in terms of workplace safety. But you start to see issues of African-American workers and issues of injuries, such as the Philadelphia Tribune reporting that William Wright, age 45, of 905 Coates Street, Coatesville, died at Coatesville Hospital. He was a fire tender in one of the open hearth furnaces, and his clothing caught on fire, is badly burned in his body. Well, anyway, I won't continue. But the issue is that workplace conditions are, of course, going to be potentially less than ideal for a number of reasons. Part of it is the issues of innovations in technology. Historians of science will continually say, well, you need to go through that process, and sadly, that's going to be one of the results of it. Others will say the opposite end of the spectrum is that, there's not a reliance or a money being pumped into the cause of workplace safety and support and aid for workplace safety. So you have these issues. African Americans.
Was there a date on that? Was there a date on that paper? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh yeah, sure. No, please, because I'm going on very long.
So I'm Charles Lukens Houston III,
Mhm.
and I joined the company in 1960,
Mm.
and I worked in the open hearth
Right.
and all the productions. And
Yeah.
I'm listening to some of your concerns there.
Right.
And it's interesting to relate, because when you talk about those incidences,
Yeah.
a lot of those things did happen.
Right.
We did try to have protective equipment at that
Mhm.
time for the men to wear.
Mhm.
In many cases, they didn't want to wear them because they were too heavy.
Yeah, and this is what
I'm just trying to get a date
no,
on it.
I love it. I mean, I have to say to you right now that, and I can't wait to get into these discussions more
Sure.
when I'm finished. And I apologize for
No,
going
I'm sorry.
very
I
long,
apologize for
very
stopping.
long tonight too. No, I don't. I kind of wish it would be a little more interactive. I'm being kind of a little too much lecturing at you, so I apologize for that. But before I get to the
Go ahead.
case, and we're not going to get into the case a lot. What we're going to do is we're going to see the case is going to be kind of an inevitable consequence of what we're going to see in terms of discrimination, and then we'll see what the case said and the court said about their decision. But these issues are all significant, and there's not always easy answers. I mean, I don't think that's why I said there's two different sides of a spectrum of opinion, and also what's even happening. It's easy for a historian to interpret. It's another even thing here for me to not have lived through the moment in a town where people were living through that, and then all of a sudden have the chutzpah, so to speak, to come in here and then say, here's what I can think. I have to be hedge all of this by saying that it's not that inside information. It's just another perspective, kind of compiling information. But I'm actually almost done, because even though it sounds like it wouldn't be
Yeah,
the
I'm
case.
sorry to interrupt you.
Oh no, that's fine. That's fine. No, thank you. Like I said, I've been going on quite a long lecture tonight, so it's not like one of these 20-minute ones. So that's I apologize for that. So basically, when you get into other conditions for African American workers, and this is white and black workers throughout the country at the time, segregation is happening in the North. It's happening in the South. It's not that we often don't talk about it in the North, but the fact is it is happening, and it's going to even inform this case. These last issues of race and racism. They spread to housing. I often think of issues of housing as voluntary versus mandatory, often in terms of in terms of segregation. Voluntary segregation it does happen. I mean, there's no question that people come from different ethnic groups and religious groups and live with one another in neighborhoods, or that happens. The issue of what I consider mandatory segregation is, are there policies that restrict people's mobility potentially to move between neighborhoods if it's residential, or jobs if it's economic? That is one of the issues then legally that's often then a challenge for civil or political rights, if individuals or groups of people feel they're not getting that mobility, and that should at least be available. And then certainly the issues of company housing around the state. We see segregated company housing in coal towns and steel mills towns and brickyards. Some of the, again, neighborhoods are just voluntarily segregated by ethnic group, but company housing is also segregated often. And I know the Louis Kahn designed steel worker housing was pretty significant after World War II, and actually a really interesting and intriguing point. I think when we were doing our study and we were looking at the built environment, as much as it certainly reflects about issues of segregation and certainly brings those issues up, it still also talks about architecture and housing and all sorts of very interesting kind of dynamics as well, and kind of brings those up too. And certainly kind of interestingly enough, it's kind of one other piece of this large-scale puzzle here that you have here. So getting finally to Lukens and the story of Goodman, and part of this, I did by a combination of interviewing individuals. I ended up, when I was doing this study for the state several years ago, we would have loved to interview dozens and hundreds of people. It's another one of these kinds of issues where you have a limited amount of time and resources, and so you get as much as you can. I do think we got some really fascinating information that adds to the pieces that are already in place in terms of what was even said in the court cases with all the witnesses that went up to talk about what happened. But I ended up interviewing Charles Butler, John Robinson, and James Kennedy. He's a former mayor of South Coatesville, is that right? As well. And they certainly offered, a very honest and open opinions of their, the strengths that they had in working in the community, the positive power of working in the community, and having these jobs, but at the same time, the difficulties and the tragedies of race and racism. And obviously here, for this kind of case, it transcends just issues of, we're not even talking about just company or labor, we're talking about both. And that's sort of been my theme throughout this whole kind of this presentation tonight, is that a lot of this transcends issues of company or labor. So to me, it's something more, and it's something I think needs to be examined on that level. But that's just a personal. That's where I'm unbiased, I guess, or I am biased, I guess, because I said how that's the biased part. But we can talk about that. So basically, Charles Butler, who was the president of Coatesville's United Political Action Committee and would be one of the plaintiffs for Goodman, the Goodman case, ended up stating some very significant issues that he had with what he basically had for problems in the workplace. And of course, the case of Goodman centering around remuneration of back pay for years of what was described as unequal compensation on the part of the company, reparations due to potential discriminatory practices in the workplace with the union as well, failure to get promoted. These were some of the issues that Charles Butler fought for with the United Political Action Committee, as well as many different groups of individuals and individuals themselves who fought for these on these issues. So Butler pointed out that he said that a lot of the conditions were akin to what was usually thought of as the Jim Crow workplaces of the South. He said there was often a lack of vertical mobility, emphasizing African Americans, quote, would not often get promoted, and contended that, quote, even the washrooms were segregated. I know there are cases about when that would change. Butler also mentioned an instance while he was, quote, involved with the NAACP, quote, during which he and his fellow comrades went, quote, down to meet with them, who were the plant supervisors, and, quote, we asked the guy why the washroom facilities were segregated. The manager's response to the chagrin of Butler and his associates was, quote, the Afro-Americans wanted to be together. Butler thought the answer was absurd and said, now wait, I said, man, you ain't going to make me believe that. Another interviewee, John Robinson, recounted the tenuous circumstances of black laborers of Lukens from the 1940s to the 70s when he said, quote, the white supervisors would not take a complaint from a black worker. Quote, Robinson said, quote, you had to go to your black representative in order to present a complaint that in itself was one of the reasons why the lawsuits even came about. And there were other things that, blacks had a certain washroom, certain locker room, and could not go to another locker room. James Kennedy, who had worked at the plant for a period of several decades beginning in the 1930s, offered an especially vivid picture of what it was like to work at Lukens over the years. Kennedy, who moved to Coatesville as an infant with his family in 1913, insisted that opportunities for advancement were tough early on, remarking that, quote, as far as you could go was often in the labor gangs or the shears. I think I may have lost my place. So that's good enough for now. Because basically what we're going to find is that when we see the documents that were entered into evidence during the case, you're going to see similar stories and much more explicit and much more provocative and topics that are discussed, and again often based on issues of race or racism. For example, Charles Goodman, who was the Goodman behind the case, who was an acetylene, is that the right way to say burner? Mm-hmm. Acetylene burner, believed that he did not have, or believed he had the skills to request an assignment to a burner job. He was assigned instead to a laborer's job in the pool, and claimed eventually to further have been arbitrarily and discriminatorily denied a transfer to an all-white subdivision. And so we also then have Goodman's case where he then eventually suffers a heart attack, ends up becoming a security guard, was also trying to be promoted within the plant security department, said that he was not able to be promoted. So there's these kinds of cases that came up that certainly were part of the beginnings of the dynamic here too. I do want to go to stop, and since I've been talking a lot tonight, so I just want to pull up a few documents, and then we can kind of just have a discussion and end this discussion, because even though what I talked about was really the context more than the cases themselves. Once the case comes to, which is filed in 1973 and then goes through the 70s, goes to 84. This is actually the appeals court decision, which is the second in the process of the three that's often talked about. There's the case that's filed that is in 1984 that is found in partial favor for the plaintiffs. And then in 86 we'll see essentially that is upheld. The one key point that's going to be upheld that we'll have to kind of analyze here just a bit from in this decision and then the Supreme Court decision is going to be the discriminatory practices are going to be talked about as happening within both the company and or the union in terms of what individuals' claims were, essentially. The issue of disbursement of funds and the issue of statute of limitations on those funds was one of the more controversial kind of points, and one that eventually the appeals court and the Supreme Court would uphold the appeals court decision, that it's a much narrower window, I guess, a narrower window of when those funds and how many funds can be dispatched. But what I do think is interesting here, though, is you have kind of a listing of what was found here when and this is just confirming what was found essentially in 1984. So this is the appeals decision in 86, but it's confirming that, for example, number one here, initial job assignments to higher paying craft jobs were skewed in favor of whites. Blacks were also assigned in higher percentage than whites to pool positions, which had seniority provisions inferior to those in subdivisions. Two, evidence focusing on transfers or more desirable craft positions demonstrated that whites were favored over blacks by a substantial margin. Three, incentive pay was denied to workers in the predominantly black crews in the Pitt subdivision. 4, Lukens discriminated against black workers by discharging a higher percentage of black employees during the probationary period. Anyhow, the district court also determined, as it says down here, unions were guilty of discrimination, failing to challenge discriminatory discharges of probationary employees, failing and refusing to assert instances of racial discrimination as grievances, tolerating and tacitly encouraging racial harassment. Again, I think if there's any theme that I have with the whole evening tonight and with this large scale discussion with lots of information that I hit you with, and I apologize if your heads are hurting because I just pounded you over the head with. It was historian context time tonight. Is that there is this kind of transcendence, obviously. The case talks about it, and the case does discuss this issue, that the issues of the union and the issues of the company. And that the fact is, does that, my question for you then, or for everybody, does that reflect then that this is something that transcends, class and issues of, and really kind of then, even though we often talk about class as being a major factor, kind of comes to an element of race and issues of what a hierarchy of race is, or what kind of positions people held for long periods of time based on assumptions, racial assumptions. That's one potential way to look at it. It's very complicated. I'm simplifying it to the nth degree in terms of the legal portion of the case. I really wanted, like I said to you tonight, to kind of give you a lot of the social, cultural, economic, in some senses, in terms of just the description of the landscape, context surrounding why these incidents would come up, why the feelings of discrimination throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, what historic legacy that they had, or in some cases didn't have, because there are some of those examples of the positive work experience, but certainly connections to a legacy of discrimination, and then kind of trying to then understand these dynamics. So I'll stop at that point. So thank you very much.
Doctor, can I add something to you then?
Yes.
Yeah, I think you did a great job. Thank you. Let me just suggest something to you here. There's a book that we'll give to you as a gift in terms of the 200 years of melting in Coatesville. Right. One of the things that it makes it difficult to understand is Lukens back before in the 1949 era was actually 5 different companies. And then it combined. His father then became president in 1949. During that time, we still had a union in Luken Weld, and they had their own representation. And then we had 1165, which was all the other union parts of the company. But within the 1165, there's a separate group called Trades and Crafts. And I can see where this is coming out of the Trades and Crafts, because they were the spun heads department. We have a model right outside here, they're spinning the heads. Right. And a lot of those were very difficult and time-consuming jobs. Now, again, I have to tell you that there were, because I was part of I worked through labor and everything else with the company. We had what we called company and labor committees, which was found to be unconstitutional. But we were able to alleviate a lot of the problems by sitting down and then explaining to them what the situation was. Jim Kennedy was a great guy, and I had a problem out in the field, especially with the track labor, and he came up to me and said, "Mr. Houston, let me help you." And I said, "I can't talk the language that you can." And he said, "I understand that." And when he did, I said, we can't say that. He said, "No, but I can." I said, "Well, all I want you to know is that there are some things we need to do. I want to make sure they understand the danger and the safety that we're trying to put through the company, especially with the narrow gauge locomotives. You see this out here, this narrow gauge, and some of those are very dangerous. And and one of them wanted to bump up. They wanted to be engineers, many of them were. They qualified. But again, there were some that weren't. Now, I will tell you this, speaking to the family, another group that came into Coatesville way back in the 17, when the railroad had Pullman conductors and trainmen and so on. And, Pullman, what do you call it?
Porters, yeah.
And they would change crews in Coatesville. And that's what started the YMCA in Coatesville. And then that's where a lot of families grew up there.
Right.
And then we had World War II, the only one I can remember. Yeah. when they started bringing some of the younger men up
Right.
to the schools looking for jobs, and they found that if they could work at Lukens, they wouldn't have to go to war, because this was a defense-related company. And for them, they thought this was an opportunity to grow.
Right.
But now you have to introduce the fact that we had Scottish, Irish, Ukrainian, others that came in, and these were some tough guys, and they were tough union people. And these fellows tried to meld in with them, and they were very good workers. But we saw the clashes within the union,
Yeah.
and we were trying to work that in as management. And I saw a whole evolution. As a matter of fact, I
Yeah.
think at some point I'll try to write my experiences when I had that, but I think you'll see it in that book, because the company did try to address these issues as they came up. And we were able to save a lot of them before they actually became union, they were complaints.
Right.
And then we tried to keep them as complaints before they became grievances. When they became grievances, then they became a union matter, and we could not address it any further until the union itself brought it to the company management at that point.
And I mean, even just the issue that you've mentioned when you're talking about the different ethnic groups who are here, I mean, again, with American history, that is sort of there are so many cases of this kind of complexity with, one of the things that comes to mind in kind of a popular culture sense is the Gangs of New York, which then was turned into a film by Martin Scorsese and during the Civil War, and one tiny piece of it. First of all, there's the issues of the nativist parties. So there's the issues of new immigrants versus old Americans, essentially, and both different white individuals, essentially, but different religious backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, fighting each other, class backgrounds, although in those cases, generally, it's both working class communities, but just different ethnicity and different religion. But you throw into the mix, again, the issue of Irish Americans coming off the boats in large numbers, and in the 1860s, the Civil War going on, and then there's a draft for Union soldiers, and the New York City draft riots, which occur, and then you have a whole dynamic there, which are disproportionately Irish men who don't want to go to war, who are feeling forced to come off the ship and pay this money when wealthier people can pay the money to get out of the war, potentially, number one. Also are forced to go to war for something that they may or may not believe in, or in terms of cause. Again, we can analyze the idealism of it. There's certainly abolitionism, and there will be actually many Irish brigades who serve very well and honorably in the North. There's Irish brigades in the South too, in the Confederacy as well. But there's also a disproportionate number of Irish Americans who are then involved in these riots within New York City, who then destroy black-owned properties and homes. So again, it's kind of one of these dynamics where, you just have these tensions that often boil among ethnic groups for a variety of different reasons. At least in terms of again, I guess transcending class, this kind of comes back to issues of ethnic differences. But there is a class dynamic to it. So that's what I meant there. I'm sorry, I don't know if that kind of segued a little too far away from what you were saying. I also did want to say that I didn't give the second piece of my speech as much as I would have liked to, which was the part which was going to talk about the context of the Goodman case, that other places in the 1950s, a number of other plants around the country in the South and the North, were actually had African American workers who were then starting to advocate for pay parity or lawsuits that were put forth. And there's precedents for some cases in even Birmingham, Alabama, a number of different cases that kind of laid the groundwork for individuals in Lukens, like the United Political Action Committee and others, to feel, hey, there have been cases that have been successful. And also to highlight that this was happening around the country. Again, not to diminish that, stories of what's happening in a particular place, but it is part of the American landscape, and it's something that's happening continually, and it's something that is also being fought against, too. Let me just say that, because it's not just happening continually, it's being fought against. So, and it's certainly in the backdrop of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which I also didn't talk about, and Title VII giving a lot of individuals the kind of impetus to feel that they had this right to sue for issues of economic discrimination and opportunity. So that's happening in other places in Goodman.
Well,
I tried to put that into the
we did have our hands tied with the trade and crafts, because that was a separate negotiation in the contract with both Lukenweld and the loop there, the labor with the 1165, and we actually were told that not to get involved with it because it would go to international, and they wanted to try to solve these situations on a local level.
Any other questions? Or?
So you say this is still going on? This isn't settled yet?
Well, that's something, I don't know how many people here are involved in the legal aspect of the case. I know the dispersion issue has not been resolved entirely. I don't know how that's kind of played out in the last decade. There's controversial, it's provocative. I know it's not something that is, the courts basically said that new cases can be heard on like a case-by-case, I guess, level. There was dispersion. There was also the issue of the statute of limitations, which said that it could not go back before 1967 or 68, and many of the cases had to do with those years, so there's a lot of fight. When it went to the Supreme Court, the really interesting thing about this appeals court case that went to the Supreme Court is, that I found at least, was that all the parties wanted to appeal it for different reasons. You had the black workers, African American workers, who felt there wasn't a fair dispensation or compensation, and or the statute of limitations issue was being narrowed. There were the unions who felt that, and one of their big arguments, and there was many of their arguments, was that unions themselves technically aren't supposed to even take this role. It's supposed to be the company's role, that in a negotiation there was something called a passive approach. That was one of their kind of pieces of language, but also wanted to be taken out of the suit, essentially, as being part of it. And of course, in terms of management and, everything about thinking that, defending their position, which is going to happen as a defense.
So there was some disbursement, you said? There was?
I believe
there were some payoffs in there.
There were payoffs, right?
Okay.
I know that the number, I know that there was also a potential for a settlement that was then rejected. So these are kind of some of the areas that I'm a little bit gray on, so I'm going to have to kind of take the fifth on, just tell you that I don't have as much of that information.
Okay, well, just
in terms of that, I don't know if anyone here has additional information on that or ideas on that.
Yeah, because the company sold 97, 98.
Right.
Bethlehem, they go bankrupt.
Right.
They're trying to get money out of that.
Well, yeah, that's the other issue. Right. That's it. That's the other issue. So the question though was, I guess, the period from 87 to 97.
Yeah, 10 years.
What happened and how, I'm not sure.
Sure.
And I'm sure I could find out and do further research on it. So I apologize for not having that kind of dynamic. But.
My question is at the bottom of the screen there. It says that the courts found that the plaintiffs had not presented adequate proof.
Oh, right. There's also some parts it found that there was adequate presentation, and other parts were not. So it was a complex decision, even though it agreed with the plaintiffs in general for many discriminatory practices, and it affirmed that. It also really broke down a number of different areas and said that they couldn't find enough legal grounds for those particular areas to say discrimination happened in those particular areas, even though they were argued that they did. So I think it's really just a matter of, even though you could see it as kind of a complex decision, ideologically speaking, on an idealistic level, actually I should say ideologically, on an ideological level, it was addressing the issue of discrimination, and it did that ideologically. It said that this is an issue that was happening. It also kind of reflected the precedent of all these other cases that had happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and said that this is, and cited these kinds of, the judges cited these different cases and said that that's why we also confirmed that there's precedent here as well. But at the same time, it had these nuances, like that not everything is, there's lots of specifics to the case. Some things were not accepted entirely, other things were supported, but I guess not ruled on in favor of. And so that's where you end up getting that kind of piece of the puzzle. But you do end up having, again, a condemnation of these kinds of practices. It's I have to say, I find it really fascinating because in 1987, we're talking about the Rehnquist court in the Supreme Court. It's a conservative court, essentially 6-3 usually, or 5-4 at least. And it's a conservative decision, and on some levels upholds the piece of not playing a role of going back and changing what states say, So there's that kind of element, I guess, in terms of conservatism. So there's the issue of not playing a role, the extra role, upholding that ideology. There's also the issue of saying that they accept the narrower window of the appeals court, in terms of statute of limitations. And so those who were saying that that should be broadened felt, hey, that's a conservative decision. You're supporting something conservative with that. But at the same time, it's also affirming the issues of discrimination from a kind of a conservative language. I think the broader picture of what happens to people. So I kind of find that interesting. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I just have one other question. Is
Yeah.
why did the Supreme Court not look at compensation before 1968? I'm not sure exactly when Lukens went union, but did
49.
going union did going union help to codify some of these discrimination practices? Is that part of the? Or?
There was something. It actually goes beyond that. From what, again, the analysis that I looked at, it has more to do with cases of disbursement of funds and statute of limitations based on state law.
Which just
it's kind of a more general kind of and personal injury.
It's
and
a line
personal
in
injury.
saying they say 7 years. Or
Right,
whatever.
and personal injury versus,
That's
then,
interesting.
right, those kinds, so kind of in a broader sense. I know that it certainly refers back to some mid to late 19th century laws as well, but to try to connect those pieces. But I personally didn't see that connection. Again, that's where, this, to me, this could have a great panel. I mean, this would be, what would really be interesting would be to have like lawyers and to have historians and to have legal and or social cultural historians because I'm only one piece of this whole cog of kind of giving you the social context. I'm not diminishing or apologizing for, I think I'm an expert in particular areas, but I also think that there are legal nuances that are probably, I'm doing the best I can to pick up on here, and if we had a lawyer in the crowd or a lawyer on the panel, that probably would be a little bit
May I
better
offer something?
answered. Yeah.
I see the seniority, because that has always been an issue with management and labor. But one of the things that was interesting was when we were called in 1980 to look at the Lukens Steel Co. And we were just over there to look at some pieces to see if we could use something that they had back here. We got a call in from the fellow in Cleveland who bought most of the stuff. He went bankrupt. So they came back and asked us if we would reconsider to buy the plant and everything and with it. We got it for 10 cents on the dollar. Now, having done that, we then took the vice president that worked over there from here. He worked over there, we brought him here, and then we sent him back over to interview all of the employees that worked at the company at the time. And we actually got it running again to the point that when we did set it up, it was a one seniority, just company-wide seniority. So, and people could bump from one job to the next job to not job. Here you had 5 seniority units. You could only go up as far as you could in one seniority, but you couldn't go over unless you went to the bottom for the seniority of the next unit when you went up.
Right.
And that was the union situation that we were dealing with at that time. And we were non-union over there, and it was very well liked. Matter of fact, the union had a trailer that they had every Friday, beef and beer and all that kind of stuff. And the guys would drink their beef and beer and come back down and vote out. So no, we still didn't want it. And we have some of the best train runners over there were women, still are. And so there's some wonderful operations that went with that company. Now, when Bessemer took it over, it separated out. ArcelorMittal now owns that as a separate company from here, although they do buy the steel from here to take it over there and run it through some thinner type of products. But it's still, from what I understand, a one subdivision seniority unit. Now, maybe some of you may want to look
Yeah,
at.
no, that's
Because the case goes to 86.
Right.
But that actually happened in 82.
Right.
Well, great. Anybody have any other questions? No? If not, this has been great. I think it's this is the the formal we want to do in celebrating Black History Month, and you have a company with a long and proud history, and it's interesting to explore all aspects of that, and the labor relations is definitely one. I don't know. I just finished a book. I recommend it to everybody, of course. Is Mastering Iron by Mary Ann Niles. She's a GIS mapping professor up at Middlebury College, and she compared then 2 Pennsylvania plants and 2 Birmingham or Alabama plants,
wow.
and
Okay.
and did a little bit of the
Yeah.
what made it successful.
Right.
Steel operation, and it had to do with geography and location and all kinds of fun things. But she definitely talks about labor relations
Right.
and making a successful company. But we really, yeah.
And I also just want to say that, you know, the hard topics are there to talk about. The other issue that kind of would round us out a little bit better, and that's another thing that I'm also involved in doing right now and writing about, is there are stories of like the proud stories of the African American community, and the stories of working, and the stories of the institutions and the vibrancy of these institutions. The danger sometimes with talking only about the negative is not that it should always be talked about, but it can also be the issue of victimization, even from the African American agency angle. So many African American scholars will say that stories should also be about strengths, you know, as well as, you know, victimization issues. But it doesn't say that you should ignore these hard issues. And so they're so I do kind of feel like it's tricky when you do Black History Month stuff.
Yeah,
Are you celebrating or are you not celebrating? I mean, that's sort of my point. Are you celebrating or are you not celebrating? Because sometimes there's issues that don't feel very celebratory.
Right,
You know,
right.
that's really my issue. And other times there are issues that are celebratory, and I think they're both valid.
Yeah, the history that hurts. But, well, we use Black History Month as an impetus to rally around and have a point of opening ourselves up to the history of the company and everybody's history of the company. So, again, we really appreciate you coming out tonight and talking to us.
Appreciate it very much. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
appreciate it. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, what's our next lecture? It's Women's History Month, and we have the the Rebecca Lukens and support, you know, not necessarily an Underground Railroad station master, but because of her high profile.